Hello everyone and welcome to the Constructive Criticism Network. This network is here to help you improve at Magic the Gathering at every level. From Pauper Leagues to Top 1000 Mythic, we've got you covered. If you want to hear the entire network, head on over to our sponsor at puremtgo.com, where you can hear each and every show, each and every week, and check out their sponsor, MTGO Traders, and tell them that the CCMTG Network sent you. Now sit back, enjoy the show. From YouTube, podcasts, and more, here's this week's episode from ConstructiveCriticism.com.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 97 of the Common Knowledge Podcast. I'm your host, Jared, and I am joined by the Delver Master himself, Colton. What's going on today, Colton?
Not much. How you doing, Jared?
I'm doing all right. I had an exciting match this week that I'm ready to talk about. But before we get into that, I want to remind everybody that we on the Common Knowledge Podcast and every podcast on the Construct are on the. One more time. I want to remind everyone that Common Knowledge and all of the podcasts on the Constructed Criticism Network are sponsored by puremtgo.com. If you would like to support the show, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Constructed Criticism YouTube channel. With that out of the way, let's get this show on the road. And I'm going to fumble over all of my words, apparently, but that's okay. This isn't an audio medium or anything. That's not important.
Yeah, never didn't have it, right?
Never. I always have every word ready to go, even
Exactly.
written down in front of me.
Every single word, always, never fumbles.
All the words. So, as many of you know, there is a banned and restricted announcement on Monday. And Colton, did you want to talk a little bit about what happened to our format?
So, literally nothing happened to our format, which is perfectly fine with me. I don't know about how you all feel. Ian Duke's article today, he mentioned a whole bunch of the other formats, such as Historic and Pioneer, Modern, and Legacy, but he wrote nothing about Pauper, which usually, typically when Wizards does that, it means that there's not much for them to really see or complain about. If there was any sort of issue they were looking at, they normally post it there. So it looks like they think that the format is pretty healthy as it sits at the moment.
Yeah, like you said, nothing at all, and I don't think there's anything really to say about the format. There's a lot of decks that people play, and they all have play against one another, and it's nothing like it was this time last year with Astrolabe and that whole mess. So I'm pretty happy with everything. I'm enjoying my matches with Pauper.
Yeah, it's a Pauper metagame right now. I feel like is in a pretty good spot, especially compared to last year when Modern Horizons just came out and people were trying to figure out what all the cards do, and Astrolabe was making mana bases so good. It was not a very fun time.
Yeah, every deck being 5-color turns out is just not healthy.
No, it turns out when you have everyone has perfect mana, it's not very good.
But that's all that we have to say on the band announcement. Like every other format was hit in some form or another, but that's not what this podcast is about. So we don't need to get into it.
Yep.
But like I said earlier, there are a ton of decks in the format. So we're gonna break down, as is Magic tradition, the top 8 decks of Pauper at the moment, and we're going to go by the list on MTG Goldfish if you want to follow along with us. And at number 1, at about 10% of the meta, we have a deck that you talked about last week, the Scred Fairies deck.
Yeah, so I think Scred's just in a pretty good spot right now. You still have the counter spells and the disruption that just has some pretty good play against some other decks in the format, and Bolt and Scred are always pretty good removal, and I think that combination just allows the deck just to kind of keep sitting where it's at. And people also really love Delver, so it will always be around.
And we'll round up the top 4, talk a little bit about those. We have Tron in second place at about 8%, and Affinity also around 8%, which is surprising to me. I haven't seen it that high in a very long time. And we have Burn at about 7% of the meta, a little bit more than 7%.
Yep. So it looks like Tron is doing Tron things. I was reading an article by Alex Ullman last week about how Tron kind of faded for a couple of weeks, but then people have figured out how to, of course, bring it back and just make it good again like it always is.
Yeah, I mean, Tron is as we said before, it turns out having a perfect 5-color mana base is not not great for the format. But if you only have one deck that can do that, that deck is going to be pretty good if it can play literally any card in the format.
Mm-hmm. Being able to play 5 colors is pretty good.
It is, and just being able to flicker your things all the time, it turns out is pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
And Affinity, I haven't played much of recently, but I guess throwing a big ATOG at somebody's face is still pretty good.
Yeah, throwing a big ATOG, and I think a lot of it is just people. This is one of those classic decks that people just always love to play. Sometimes it's not as good as other times, but it's just always so. To me, I think it's one of the really fun decks to play. It's a very beginner friendly deck, and so it's always going to have a good representation in the meta.
Yeah, and speaking of something that I personally think is a good beginner deck, we talked about Burn being in fourth place at the moment. Burn always an interesting meta call because when it's good, but when it's bad, it's bad. It's easy to beat if you know it's coming.
Yeah, we had our fair share of getting beat on when we tried to play Burn, but it's one of those decks that it's always going to be there. The cards are really easily acceptable. They see play in a lot of other formats, so a lot of people are already familiar with it. If anyone plays like Modern or Legacy, it's a very common deck there, so a lot of pieces are already there and easy to pick up.
Yeah, and to round out the top 8, in 5th place at the moment, at about 5% of the meta, we have Delver Fairies, which is the mono blue Delver deck. And the rest are all at the same percentage, actually. We have the mono green Stompy deck at 6, Elves at 7, and my favorite deck, the Boros Monarch deck, at 8. And that's 8 decks with at least 5% of the meta. And that leaves what 60% for the rest of the decks. That's not even everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a pretty good spread right now. One way that I see for an Eternal format is if you don't see a deck go above about 10%, that typically means that the meta is fairly healthy.
Yeah, healthy, super diverse. If there's a type of deck that you're looking for, it is somewhere to be found.
Yeah. Yeah, you can tell a good Eternal format meta, especially if something starts to hit about 15%, that's when you should really start worrying. But the fact that nothing's over 10% is a good sign for us.
Yes, very good. Is there anything else that you'd like to say about the meta before we go a little bit deeper into one of these decks?
Not particularly. Just as you guys know, this isn't a perfect. This isn't going to be a perfect list, of course, because especially with the way that Wizards does data, it's not always balanced. But this is if you guys want to ever look at decks or want to kind of take a guess as to what especially the current online meta is, MTG Goldfish is always a good place to start your guys' journey into looking at what's good in the meta right now.
Yeah, that's something that we should have mentioned at the top. You're right. This is the MTGO meta. This may not apply if you play at your local store at all, because like just by virtue of Pauper being super, what's the word I'm looking for?
Just very diverse.
Diverse. That is the word I was looking for. Any local meta can be completely different from this. That's a good thing.
Yeah, and that's a-okay. That's totally fine. Always remember, guys, that your number one meta is your local meta.
Yeah, the meta that you're actually playing in. And I don't think I have anything else to say either, other than I love the fact that everything is super diverse. Everything is there are kind of expensive decks that are good. There are cheap decks that are good. There are aggro decks, control decks. Somehow, any flavor of Magic you're looking to play, it's available.
You can play combo in this format. You can play mid range. You can play control. You can play aggro. You can play tempo, and they're all very viable strategies currently.
So for this episode, we're gonna go into one of the more control-y decks of the format, and that is Tron. And I'm gonna preface this by saying this is far from my favorite deck.
Yeah, it's not my favorite deck either.
No, but it is good, and you can't deny that.
Yeah, it turns out having 7 mana on turn 3 is pretty good.
It's good, and it's 7 mana of any color. And by virtue of it being so good and effective and popular right now, if a deck wants to be successful in the format, it needs to be able to fight it on one axis or another.
That's one of the things about Tron that makes it so good is it just has so many it can play a lot of like 1, 2, or 3 of cards just because it has ways of finding the cards that it needs, and it can fight on a lot of different axes and just win games in lots of different ways.
Yeah, but like with any control deck, it can seem pretty unbeatable in the hands of a good pilot. But if somebody who is inexperienced with either the format or even the deck itself, it can feel like it does nothing.
Yep, pretty much it. That's one of the things about Tron and a lot of control decks in general is that it's really kind of hard to tell exactly what the game plan is just by looking at the list. You kind of have to know what the cards do, how they interact, and things like that. Because on the surface, the deck doesn't really look like it does much.
No, it really doesn't. And looking at a list now, I'll just go through one real quick. The top on MTG Goldfish right now is the creatures are 4 Stonehorn Dignitary, 3 Mnemonic Wall, 4 Muldrifter, and 2 Denrovahor. And of course, the biggest thing on that list is a 4/4, and there's only 2 of them. And I mean, in Pauper especially, you win with your creatures. You win through damage, and it can be hard to do that with only got 2 creatures with 8 power across them, another 4 with 2. We've got 3 more with 0 and 4 with 1. There's a total of 20 power in this deck, and that makes for some grindy games.
Yeah, this is definitely a deck that it wins really by making sure that your opponents kind of can't do anything, by making sure that you over time just gain a slow amount of advantage and just kind of running them out of resources until they can't do anything to fight your 2/2 flying Muldrifter or your 4/4 Denroven horror.
Right, yeah. Stonehorn Dignitary, if you're unfamiliar with it, it's a 1/4 for 4 mana, 3 and a white. And when it enters the battlefield, target opponent skips his or her next combat phase. And that is a important part of the deck is stopping damage. As I mentioned before, decks and Pauper win through creature damage, unless you're playing Burn, of course. And which is what makes it a good meta call when Tron is heavy in the format. But if go ahead.
So with the Sigma Dignitary, it kind of seems you're stopping them from attacking for 1 turn, but this deck, because of how much mana it produces, can abuse that over and over and over and over again.
Yes, and
that's part of what makes it so good.
Yeah, we'll continue on with the list with the spells. We have this one has only 4 ways to flicker creatures, which seems low, in 3 Ephemerate and 1 Ghostly Flicker, but there's impulses to find them. There's 1 Moment's Peace, which is a fog with flashback. 2 Prohibit for some counter spells, more card filtering with compulsive research, and mystical teachings. There's 1 Reign of Revelation, which I have never seen before. Draw 3 cards and then discard a card. That's new.
Yeah, that's definitely the new tech in this deck. I think it's one of the newer cards.
Yeah, there's a lot of flashback in this deck, so it ends up being just a draw 3, I think.
So for those of you unfamiliar with how Stonehorn Dignitary, why it's really good in this deck is because of the card Stonehorn Dignitary, Mnemonic Wall, and Ghostly Flicker. So if you cast a Stonehorn Dignitary, your opponent skips their next combat step. And then the card Mnemonic Wall is 4 and a blue for a 0/4 defender, and when it enters the battlefield, you may return target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand. And Ghostly Flicker, it's 2 and a blue for an instant. It says exile 2 target artifact, creatures, and or lands you control, and return those cards to the battlefield under your control. So the kind of one of the goals of this deck is that you cast a Stonehorn Dignitary, then cast a Mnemonic Wall and target whatever you have in your graveyard, and then use Ghostly Flicker to target both the Mnemonic Wall and the Stonehorn Dignitary, and they will both enter. Their triggers will go on the stack, and you can use the Mnemonic Wall to get back your Ghostly Flicker, and then do it again next turn, and do it again next turn, and do it again next turn, and essentially soft lock your opponent out of beating you through combat damage.
Yeah, as far as I can tell, the goal of the deck is to just tilt out your opponent so they concede. That's how that's how it ends up going when I'm on the other end.
Yeah, the deck is very, very good at not dying. That's essentially the goal of the deck, is you don't die.
And then you hope that Denrovahor is somewhere in your top 40 cards or so that you can close the game out.
Or that you can get a Muldrifter and swing in for 2 damage in the air every turn.
Just go 2 in the air for a while, you're right. And of course, the lands package of this particular deck is 4 Cave of Temptation, which is another new card that I'm unfamiliar with. Colton, will you read that one for me?
So Cave of Temptation, it enters untapped and it taps for a colorless, or you can pay 1, tap it, and add 1 mana of any color, or you can pay 4, tap and sacrifice it to put 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature. You can activate that only as a sorcery.
Oh, that's actually really good. That is so much better than I used to play this deck with the oh, come on, Unknown Shores. That is infinitely better than Unknown Shores.
Yeah, this is the one out of Modern Horizons. It's really good because it not only filters your mana, but late game you can buff up your Mole Drifter into a 4/4 or your 4 into a 6/6 and actually start doing real damage to your opponent's face.
Well, so now I just feel dumb because I didn't realize this card existed, and I think all my arguments about creature damage are kind of made null by that.
Kind of, but at the same time, swinging for 4 every turn is still a 5-turn clock. It's still not particularly fast.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Rounding out the lands, we have just a single basic island, a remote isle, 4 Tranquil Cove, 4 Urza's Mine, 4 Urza's Power Plant, and 4 Urza's Tower. We've talked a lot about this deck being a 5-color deck, but so far, most of our lands just tap for blue, and we have 4 that tap for white. Of course, we have the 4 Cave of Temptation that can tap for 1 of any color, but the real prize of this deck to get all of those colors is in the artifact slot with the 4 Prophetic Prism.
Yeah, so essentially what this deck is a Prophetic Prism is 2 of any color, and when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card, and you pay 1 and you tap it, and it makes 1 mana of any color. So this deck at its heart is a base blue deck that splashes a whole bunch of cards in other colors that have 1 pip of other colors. So like the Stonehorn Dignitary is 3 and a white. Then Rovin Horror is 4, a blue and a black. The Ephemerate is a white. Moment's Peace has just 1 green. Mohos Marasa has 1 green, but most of the rest of the cards in this deck are just blue.
Yeah, most are blue, and there's no red in the main deck, only in the sideboard, but it's a pretty heavy red sideboard. We have 4 red Elemental Blasts, an Ancient Grudge, and a Fireball, of all things. We've got 3...
Yeah.
Do you have anything to say about that?
Oh no, I was just gonna say I think Fireball is a pretty good choice to help close out the game, especially in a mirror when you can just dome someone for 10 or 15 to the face.
I didn't actually realize that was a comment. I'm going to start putting a Fireball in all of my decks, I think.
Oh yeah, Fireball's pretty good.
We have 3 blue Elemental Blasts, 1 Dispel, another Moment's Peace in the sideboard, a Weather the Storm, which if you're unfamiliar, it's another card from Modern Horizons. Sneaky good. It's 1 and a green. You gain 3 life, which doesn't sound all that great, but it has that super great keyword that you love so much, Storm.
Yeah, we actually got beat by this card a couple weeks ago when we played Burn.
Wow, we did. We got blown out quite heavily by it.
Yeah, and there's not really part of what makes this card so good in the format is there's not a lot of very good counters to this card currently, unfortunately.
No, unfortunately, Flusterstorm not a part of Pauper,
and neither is Skullcrack.
And neither is Skullcrack. No, are there any cards in Pauper that say players can't gain life?
So I actually researched that last night because I was really, really curious about it, and there are not.
There are not. I can't believe I can't believe you had the answer so quickly. You just happen to be looking at that. That's funny.
Yeah, I was looking up that last night because I was thinking about our match last week where we got blown out by this card, and I was thinking, so is there anything that can help stop that? Because Weather the Storm I see it just everywhere and all these sideboards, and I was not able to. And I went to Scryfall. If any of you guys are not familiar with that, it's scryfall.com. It's easily the best Magic search engine for looking up cards. You can look up by flavor text, you can look up by mana cost, by what the card does, etc. And I looked it up, and every single card that gains life is either stops life gain is either an uncommon or a rare.
Well, there are a ton of cards that prevent
prevent damage.
No, that say that damage can't be prevented this turn.
Right.
Which is very different.
Mm-hmm. That's actually one of the cards I was going to talk about a little later. Actually, does that.
Okay, well we'll get into that later. Is there anything else about Tron that you'd like to talk? I just touched my face, and I really need to stop doing that.
Yeah. So just to kind of wrap up about Tron, this is the type of deck. If you like a deck that has a lot of mana, if you like slowly grinding out your opponents and locking your opponent out of the game, and if you're okay being considered kind of the bad guy or the boogeyman of the format, then this is probably a good choice for you. If you like those long slow games with lots of decisions, Tron is a great deck. If you're not particularly fond of long games, or if you're playing online and you're constantly in trouble with the clock of timing out or timing out, and if you tend to time out in rounds a lot, or you do not like the card Stone Rain, if you do not like your lands getting blown up, I would not recommend playing this deck.
No, and that's my biggest reason for not playing it, because I especially when I'm playing digital Magic, for some reason I get super impatient and I make the wrong decision often, and this deck punishes that super hard.
Yeah, it really really does.
Because in this list especially is super tuned, it seems, for the meta. There's only one Moments piece, only 4 Flicker cards, the 3 Ephemerate and the 1 Ghostly Flicker, and those cards. I feel like you have to really rely on those cards, because I mean creatures are how you win in Pauper outside of Burn, and if you only have effectively 8 Stonehorn Dignitaries, that seems scary to me.
Yeah, it's not. It's a deck that you have to be very comfortable playing, and you have to be comfortable with tuning a lot.
Yes.
And for some people, that's a great challenge. For others, it's just not a very good time.
No, and you can definitely put me on that list.
Yeah.
So,
all right. So I heard you had a pretty decent match this week, Jared. Did you want to tell us more about that?
Yes, I do want to talk a little bit about that. I think I have not discovered, but I have come across another answer to this boogeyman of the format, the Tron deck. Burn is one access. If you can just beat it by doing all of the damage before it gets all of its resources ready to go, that's one way to do it. But this is a deck that I played against. I was playing my favorite Boros Monarch list against what I'm calling UW Control, but I found a list on Goldfish that called it UW Flicker. It's blue light flicker on Goldfish if you want to look at it. And I think it somehow manages to out resource Tron, which is interesting.
That's a scary thing.
It is. It was terrifying. It didn't seem that great when I first played it. But once I realized what the heck was going on and how it was actually trying to win the game, I couldn't quite figure it out. It was too good for me. But I will give you what I thought was the deck list at the time, and then we can go over what the Goldfish list is. But there are creatures in this deck, in this blue-white deck. There are 4 Sunscape Familiar, which I had never seen before. And what that card is a 2-mana white wall that reads: green spells and blue spells you play cost 1 less to cast. And that will come up here in a little bit. There are 4 Seagate Oracles, 4 Muldrifters, 4 of the God Pharaoh's Faithful, which is another, it's just a 1-mana white card that says whenever you cast a blue, black, or red spell, you gain 1 life. And just trying to stall out the board with these big old butts, and looking to cast what I think was a single copy of Sage's Row Denizen, which is a newish card from N20. It's 2 and a blue, it's a 2/3, and it reads: whenever another blue creature enters the battlefield under your control, target player puts the top 2 cards of their library into their graveyard. And that is piece number 1 of the combo. The spells in this deck: 4 Ghostly Flicker, probably 3 Prismatic Strands, 4 Prohibit, some Ponders and Preordains. I thought there was a Scred at the time because they had a single copy of a Snow-Covered Mountain. The Goldfish list has Gutshot, which I guess makes more sense, but I think Scred might be even better if you're just going to be playing the Mountain anyway.
Yeah, there are some lists just taking a look, that play Gorilla Shaman in the board, it looks like.
Interesting.
And then I think there might be a couple that just play Scred just because that card is so good.
Mm-hmm.
Or Flame Slash. I've also seeing Flame Slash in here as well.
Okay, yeah, I mean all fine choices in red. But back to this deck. Game 1 was literally a 40-minute slugfest. Like it took a long time, mostly because I was trying to figure out what this person's deck was supposed to be doing, because I could not figure it out. They didn't play their Stages Road Denizen until it was turn 25 was when they played it. I did not see it until then. They were just stalling out the board, and I was holding creatures back because I wanted to see what the heck was going on.
Mm-hmm.
So what this deck does is it stalls out the board, hopes you forget to attack, which against me, bound to happen. It plays. I forgot to read off the land list. There are 4 Mystic Sanctuary in this deck. So this deck uses the 3-card combo, yes, of Ghostly Flicker, Mystic Sanctuary, and I guess it's kind of a 4-card combo. Ghostly Flicker, Mystic Sanctuary, and Sage's Road Denizen are the 3 that are important, and then you can. I'm sorry, Sage's Road Denizen stays on the battlefield, and you need 2 things to flicker with Ghostly Flicker, and this person chose to flicker Mystic Sanctuary and Seagate Oracle. And what this does, if you have 3 mountains or 3 islands on the board, this mixes. You can, when Ghostly Flicker happens, Mystic Sanctuary enters untapped, and I'm just gonna start this whole thing over again. Alright, so the opponent won by stalling out the board and looping Ghostly Flicker, targeting Mystic Sanctuary and Seagate Oracle with Sage's Road Denizen on the board. Mystic Sanctuary enters untapped, and if you have 2 Sunscape Familiars on the board, Ghostly Flicker costs 1 mana, and that gives you an infinite loop, and it mills out your entire deck, and you can't do anything.
Wow.
It's a lot. There's a lot of pieces on the board, but that's why it's super. That's why I think it's good against Tron, because it can. The games are going to go long, and you can put these pieces together.
Yeah, and Tron is also kind of known for, it doesn't have a lot of great removal pieces. So if you can stick these things, if you can make them, you can force them through with some of your counter magic, then you can usually end up in a pretty good spot with this deck, because you're not attacking, you're attacking their deck.
Right. Yes. You just hold your counter magic for the little bit of counter magic that Tron happens to have.
Mm-hmm. So after after you learned what this deck does, what happened to your other games?
So game 2, I just I decided that I didn't want to mess around. I only had like 12 minutes left on the clock. It was time to just turn things sideways and get it over with, and I curved out and beat him on turn 4, and everything was great. And then game 3, mulligan to Oblivion, and they milled me out again. But they were a lot quicker about it this time, which I appreciated.
Yeah, sometimes mulliganing into Oblivion isn't very fun.
No, it was not great. But the deck looked like a lot of fun to play.
Mm-hmm. It's probably something I would try a little bit, and that's something I would definitely try. I like silly combo decks like this.
Yeah, you said you were the big combo player, and this is the more that I talk about it now. At the time, it seemed just super weak to Bolt, and now it just seems super weak to Time.
Yeah, that's the problem with a lot of these types of slower decks and poppers, that they are really weak to Time if you're not careful.
Yes, and just like drawing out games. Games don't always go that long, and they're really not supposed to.
Yeah, and a lot of decks can kind of. That's the thing about combo decks, is that combo decks are really weak to aggro decks in general. They tend to be good against control decks, just because because control decks are pretty good at removing your threat once it's on the board. But if your threat just kills them on the spot, and you have ways to protect it, it's pretty easy to win. But against decks like elves, or just really any deck that can just go fast, dump things, swing sideways, I feel like this deck would struggle a lot, especially since it doesn't have cards like Moment's Peace to help gain a couple of extra turns.
Right. Once a big threat gets stuck, there's not much it can do. There's no removal whatsoever.
That's another weak part about combo decks is they tend to be very, very removal light. I like to play, one of my favorite decks is Storm in Modern, and there's only one way in the main deck to take something off of the table, and only takes it off temporarily.
Right.
So, anything else you want to say about this deck before we go on to our next section today?
Nothing else about this deck. I think that it's a strong call against Tron. Like I said, you just need to hold back your little bit of counter magic to counter their counter magic, and as long as you can stick your pieces, they can flicker their Stonehorn dignitaries all you want. You're gonna mill them out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like this deck is a good call if you expect to play against a lot of slower decks like Tron, but it's going to be kind of weak if you're playing against a lot of Bogles or mono green or affinity, stuff that's just going to try to kill you as quick as possible.
Right. Yeah. Anything, and that's what I mean. Any deck is dependent upon the meta on how good it's going to be. And if you're going to be playing in the Pauper Challenge or in the Showcase here coming up, you need to play online, see what decks you're going up against while you're preparing, and then just make the call from there.
Right. All right. So speaking of meta calls, this I want to talk about today is the sideboard card of the week. So
I like how the old common knowledge would just do card of the week. I like sideboard card of the week.
Yeah. So one of the things that's pretty common about, if you guys are familiar with Eternal formats, is that a lot of the time, most of the cards in the main deck tend to stay the same pretty commonly from week to week. You'll get a couple changes, like we saw with Tron getting the new land that can not only filter mana but can also put +1/+1 counters on creatures. But things like that tend to be a little bit more slow. And once you have a solid 60, it tends to change very, very little over time. Of course, there will always be improvements that happen, but most of the time, the cards that you will see change the most in Eternal formats, especially one like Pauper, is the sideboard. So one of the cards I wanted to highlight this week is Flaring Pain. And for those of you unfamiliar with this card, it's an instant for 1 and a red, and it's a damage can't be prevented this turn, and it has a flashback for a red. So I really, really like this card, especially with Tron being a very, very big part of the format right now, because one of the ways that you beat Tron in a deck, especially in a deck like Elves or Bogles, that you're just trying to get, all you really need is that 1 or 2 big swings, you can finish them off, is something that can stop the moment's piece. And a lot of times you don't have access to colors like blue where you can just counter it. So Flying Pain is really, really good in these heavy aggro decks to help you just push through those last couple points of damage. One of the biggest, looking through Goldfish right now, the biggest ones that it's in this card is in right now are Affinity, Burn, Boros, and Elves.
Yeah, I play a couple copies in my Monarch deck.
Yeah, it's really, really good against just like trying to get those last, maybe 5 or 10 points of damage, and especially if you're trying to go in an affinity, if you're going in on the swing in and then fling your a target your opponent's face, it's pretty good backup to help make sure that you don't just, if they have a way to prevent the damage, you don't just something die because you have no board.
Yeah, right. You don't want to die on the crackback if you're going for it.
Mm-hmm. So I think that this card is, if you don't have them on MTGO or in paper for your decks, I definitely would for sure pick them up. I'm looking on it online right now. They're about a 1 1/4 tick kind of floating around. They'll go up and down a lot. And in paper, they're about $1 a piece. And really, you only need about 2 or 3 of them.
Yeah, you don't want to fill your sideboard with that.
Yeah, you don't need a full 4, obviously, because you're playing it against, you tend to play this card against slower decks anyway, so it's not like you need the card in your opening hand most of the time. But yeah, this would be my sideboard pick of the week for sure.
Yeah, and uh, refresh my memory that you were talking about the ATOG fling interaction with this.
Mhm.
The way that I think that works is that since Flaring Plane has flashback, is it in your graveyard after it when it's on the stack? And can you flash it back after you fling the ATOG?
You can because it is an instant.
Right. It is in your grave. So if you attack with ATOG and then let's say you cast the Flaring Pain. I don't know why you would do that. I'm gonna skip that.
So so what you can do for sure is if you have it in your yard and someone tries to cast Moments Piece, you can flash it back in
That was the piece
response.
I
That
was
is something
missing. I knew there was a piece I was
that is
missing there.
something that is a legal play because it is an instance. You can cash it back, flash it
Yes,
back at instant speed.
that's the whole reason the card exists it's the red counter spell.
Essentially, it's a good red way to get through those last couple points of damage.
We are flying through this episode. We've only been going about 35 minutes, but I don't I don't have anything else to say about anything that we've already talked about.
Yeah, there's just one more quick thing I wanted to cover for our listeners this week.
Yeah, go for it.
So the one last thing I kind of wanted to talk about is if any of you guys like to draft a lot. One thing I was looking for this week are good draft comments to find if you're out there drafting Theros Beyond Death. We're about halfway through this draft format, I believe, and that means that some of the cards have started to pop up in some lists. And if you end up drafting at F&M or during the week this week, the two cards I would personally pick up if you can find them, or oftentimes people just throw them away. The first one is Sentinel Eyes, and let me pull that up real quick. Hold on.
It's 1 mana for an enchantment aura that gives creatures +1/+1 and vigilance. And but the thing that makes it so good is the ability of the card, the escape ability. If you want to read that, Golden.
Yeah, so it has escape for a white, and you exile two other cards from your graveyard, and you can put it right back on something.
And we talk a lot about how getting 2-for-1s in Pauper is just it's vital if your deck is going to have some play.
Yeah, especially in a deck like where you play a lot of auras, where you can get 2-for-1 a lot. Having something that can come back from your yard is really good. This is why cards like Rancor see a lot of play in the format, because you don't have as many opportunities to get 2-for-1 if you put that on something.
And you said you had a second card. It also appears to be white.
Yeah, the second one is Transcendent Envoy. And Transcendent Envoy is an enchantment creature for 1 and a white. It has flying, and it's enchantment creature Griffin, and aura spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. So both of these cards are seeing play in a lot of Bogle's decks right now. Being able to reduce your spells and also having a flyer that you can slap stuff onto if you need is really good. And the Sentinel Eyes is also seeing play in mono white heroic lists, and they play a lot of that deck plays a lot of cheap spells to throw on at your dudes so they can grow bigger and attack, and so they have a lot of fuel for the Sentinel Eyes. And the Transcendent Envoy is really good in the Bogos deck because reducing some of your 2 or 3 costed auras down to 1 or 2 is often very, very helpful. And being a flying dude, you can often just slap some auras on him and get in those last couple points of damage over your opponent's board.
Right. Is that flying a good keyword in any format?
Yep, turns out flying is pretty decent, especially when they have a board of, say, elves, or if they're playing some elves or mirror forces, you can just fly right over and get those last couple points of damage in.
And
so
what?
Oh, so I was gonna say, so those are my 2 picks for the week. If you go out drafting, a lot of times people will just at the end of the draft they don't want the commons anymore. Sometimes you can just pick them up for free, or both of them are pretty cheap right now. They're like 10 to 15 cents a piece, so they're really not hard to find.
And another card to be on the lookout for, of course, is Grey Merchant of Asphodel. It's not a common in this set, but it's still legal and still good.
Gary is always good. If you can find Gary's, always pick them up. They're good, not just good in our format, but they're also good in other formats as well.
And they'll be good in your draft.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that card is insane in draft. That card is so insane.
It's I don't actually know which format it's better in. Just if you are playing against an opponent and they have 5 mana and 2 of them are black, just be on the lookout.
Yep. If they're playing black spells and they're casting black dudes, then be on the lookout for Grey Merchant to come and ruin your day.
It will absolutely wreck your face.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it's looking like this is going to be a quick episode. We flew through all of that. Do you have anything else on the top of your head? Anything at all that you want to talk about?
No, that's pretty much what I had down for this week.
Yeah, that's everything that I've got too. So I guess you get out of here. You get out of here very quickly. That will do it for this episode of Common Knowledge. If you would like to get in touch with us, you can find me on Twitter at Dr. McBoop. You can find Colton on Twitter at BoltSnapBaral. Or feel free to email us at commonknowledgemtg@gmail.com. You can also find us on the Constructed Criticism Network Discord server. We hang out in the Pauper channel. Thanks again to our sponsor, PureMTGO.com, as well as the Constructed Criticism Network for allowing us to be a part of it. Colt, anything else you'd like to say to everybody before we go?
No, just you guys keep enjoying Pauper, and we hope to hear from you guys.
Absolutely. And last but certainly not least, be good to each other, and thank you all for listening.